Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity webinar series. NCORE is part of the Southwest Center for Human Relations Studies at the University of Oklahoma in Norman, Oklahoma. My name is Justin Links, and I use he, him pronouns. I am the program administrator for NCORE. I am seated in front of an image of the Pacific Ocean taken from the International Space Station, wearing a blue celestial appearing hoodie. And I am delighted to welcome you and be your host this afternoon. We hope that we continue the conference tradition of working to improve racial, ethnic, and intercultural relations on college campuses and community organizations by providing vital learning with opportunities like this one. Welcome to the third session of our Setting Our Compass webinar series, which is developed and offered as we prepare to take the NCORE conference to Pai'aina, the islands of Hawaii, for the first time as a forum. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. If you need to utilize closed captioning, please make sure your settings are set to on. Always remain muted, please, unless you have been requested to unmute. We ask that your background has no moving images or flashing lights. And we ask to please report specific tech accessibility and any other operational concerns via direct message to me, the session host. The presenters will take questions periodically during the sessions, and we'll facilitate this after this introduction. Please feel free to use the QA box or enter that into the chat. This session will benefit from facilitators and educators seeking to actively reduce ableism in shared learning spaces. And we are bringing it today to you today, in part to support our community of session presenters for the NCORE 2024 conference. Focusing on aspects of ableism connected to physical space, expectations of engagement, communication modalities, and interpersonal dynamics, this session will invite presenters to consider ways ableism might be proactively reduced during the planning and design process. Utilizing concrete examples of conference engagement choices to deepen our awareness, session attendees will have the opportunity to critically analyze and collectively discuss ways ableism unintentionally reinforced through the choices and assumptions we make as unintentionally reinforced through the choices and assumptions we make as facilitators. Webinar facilitators will also share examples of tools that conference presenters can use to respond to ableist pressures, comments, or language in the moment. This session is intended to create a space for practitioners to hone their already considerable skills to include practices informed by an understanding of the structures, normed procedures, and social forces of ableism. I would like to introduce you to our facilitators and panelists today. Dr. Ebony T. Johnson, Assistant Professor of Community and Behavioral Health, College of Public Health at the University of Iowa, Iowa City, Iowa, which has a team in the Final Four basketball tournament that we're really excited to be seeing. Also like to introduce Dr. Rana Yakmayan, who is the Department Chair and Professor of Counselor Education, College of Education at Portland State University, Portland, Oregon. Dr. Emma J. Coddington Brown, who is the former Associate Professor of Physiology and Biology Programs in Neuroscience, Ethnic and Women and Gender Studies, and founder of Sensate in Corvallis, Oregon. And also, Renee Wells, as Assistant Vice President of Education for Equity and Inclusion at the Office of Institutional Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Middlebury College in Middlebury, Vermont. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I turn this over to you. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. We are going to begin our presentation, accessibility in NCORE presentation spaces and actions, facilitation as anti-ableist practice. So one of the things I want to name up front is, while this is part of the Setting Our Compass webinar series, which is really meant to create intentional preparation for folks who are accepted presenters for this year's NCORE conference, I want to say up front that this session will benefit all educators and facilitators across the various spaces in which they work. So we welcome everyone who's attending, whether you are presenting at NCORE this year or not. And so I am going to pass the mic to Ebony first, and we're going to say a little bit more about ourselves just for some context.
Hello, I am Ebony Johnson, as mentioned, assistant professor in community and behavioral health in the College of Public Health at the University of Iowa. I come to this work with training in the fields of rehabilitation counseling and rehabilitation psychology, which look at access, inclusion for persons living with or at risk of developing a chronic illness or disability. And it definitely takes a social determinants of health lens, looking at education and employment as primary facilitators to independent living and enhanced quality of life. So this work is very important to me. I spent some time at McBurney Disability Resource Center when I was a doc student, doing accessibility planning and student accommodation plans. So I learned a lot at the structural level, what works well and also what needs some change along the way. So great to meet everyone.
Right, I think I'm next, right, Renee? Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rana Yagmaya, and I use she, her pronouns. As Justin said, I am chair of the Department of Counselor Education at Portland State University. I'm also an associate professor here. I run disability justice workshops across my community in a variety of settings, and I also just kind of personally live and breathe disability justice. It informs so much of what I do and relates so much to my own identities and just how I move about the world. And a lot of my research focuses on the intersection of race, disability, gender, and sexuality. So I come to this work in this webinar with informed by all of that professional and lived experience. Thank you all.
I think I'm next. My name is Emma J. Coddington Brown, and I come into this work in two different ways. One is as a professor, teaching researchers and also young students who are wanting to go into the medical fields, and ableism as an organizing framework, and disability justice was became an imperative in the ways that we could help newly emergent students come into highly westernized medical structures and make sense of the discombobulating impacts that occur in the ways that we norm bodies and minds. And then on a very personal level, I am hard of hearing and deaf, and the work by folks at Sins Invalid helped me understand what it meant to become disabled. And that may be a common experience for many folks. Anyway, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And I am Renee Wells. I am AVP of Education for Equity and Inclusion at Middlebury College, and my work spans the institution. So I do development workshops for faculty and staff on anti-ableist practice. I work across the institution on changing policies and practices to reduce access barriers, really address interpersonal dynamics that are disabling within our community. And so I'm really happy to be here as one of the members of the National Advisory Council on Accessibility for NCORE, which all four of us presenting are here representing. So I am going to pass the proverbial mic to Ebony to get us going.
Great. So to begin, there's several modalities we made possible for participant sharing The first is listed on the slide is our Google document for participant observations and questions that we'll put in the chat. And I can do that currently. The next is Zoom chat. Please pop in at any time to add comments, questions, reflections. We are happy to engage in that modality as well. The next is we understand that the need to potentially unmute for verbal observations and questions, and we welcome that at any point during the presentation. And then we like to state that we will share out a one-page curated capture afterwards with attendees. So in sum, we invite all attendees to share their reflections and ask questions as a part of the discussion throughout the webinar. Once again, sharing can be done in multiple ways, typing comments or questions directly into the Zoom platform, unmuting and speaking through the Zoom platform, or typing questions directly into the shared content online document in the highlighted sections in yellow that was placed in the chat for you to look at. We aim to compile everyone's contributions into a shared document that we'll curate. So we welcome all collaborative generation of content in real time. And please feel free to share in a way that is most comfortable and accessible for you. And I think we'll move on to the next slide. So we want to start off with just a brief overview of some of the rudimentary starting points or our list of to-dos when we traditionally think about accessibility. And feel free to add any others to the chat that you may think of or the Google Doc. So this is what we think accessibility traditionally includes. And that may be things that you see that are going on right now in our actual presentation, captioning for videos. If you have something like a PowerPoint presentation that you disseminate to your colleagues or participants, you may add alt text to images using things such as sans serif fonts because they increase readability. Thinking about the font size on your slides or your handouts so that people have who may have issues with visual impairments would be able to see those in real time. Speaking into the podium microphone so that your voice carries in the space. Thinking about color contrast on the slides that you're using so that the actual language is clear for participants. Ensuring your space has mobility, ensuring the space that you're in has space for mobility aids and devices so that people can move around the space comfortably, and then providing interpretation services such as sign language interpreting, which you see modeled here as well. So all of these things are incredibly important to do in terms of accessibility, but that's just what we would view as a starting point. And we hope that through this presentation, you see that accessibility extends more than just these lists of to-dos, and it actually includes considering frameworks that will enable you to anticipate the needs of your participants, and in that anticipation, make your space open and accessible for all outside of the things that you see presented on the screen or that you heard me mention on this slide. So the next thing we, okay, go ahead, Renee.
Quick plug, folks who want to learn more about these particular aspects of accessibility that are listed on the slide,
Yes.
NCORE is doing a session for presenters on May 2nd. So if you are presenting at NCORE, make sure to register for that. We'll post the link to the registration in the chat.
And that is there. So the first thing we want to do is, especially because we want this to be an inviting conversation where we all participate, is we have activities or a series of activities, and we call them 3 scenarios of observations and assumptions. How do we frame accessibility first? So as you see on the title, or you may not, framing accessibility first is our next part of the presentation. So for this activity, we'll discuss a series of 2 photos from past conference events. And so prior to talking about each photo, we're going to display the image on the slide and provide a verbal description of that image. And then in our Google document that we shared in the link, we invite you to share some comments about what you think about that image, put some things in the chat, or unmute yourself to think about how people could participate in a conference setting, or presumptive conference setting, by looking at those particular images. So please share your reflections. And I think Emma is going to take this ball, it is in your court now, to walk us through this activity.
Awesome. Thank you, Ebony. Okay, to remind you, inviting you to the Google Doc. The link is both in the slides and also in our chat. And if we go to the next slide, please. Okay, awesome. So we're looking at a slide titled Conference Scenario 1. And it is a photograph of a group of people sitting, diverse identities of people sitting in a circle on a carpeted section of the floor at a conference event. Some individuals are seated with their legs crossed and tucked in, and some have their legs stretched out in front of them, and some have their legs bent, pulled into their bodies with their arms resting on their knees. You can see bags behind, beside, and in front of them, and various chairs and tables, indicating that we're sitting in a common conference space off of which conference rooms would be accessible. So when you look at this image and you think about what it means to facilitate a conference gathering like this, we would like you to consider and pop in the different spaces, what observations can you make based on this image and image description? And secondly, what assumptions have we internalized about people, their identities, positionalities, and their bodies that have led to the space being used in such a way? And as we do this, this is not a situation where we're setting up a test at all. This is just a way to kind of consider and bring on your appreciation as well as your critiques, because with every kind of situation, there are benefits and there are also challenges. And we're hoping to kind of bubble up some of the things that we may or may not have thought of before. Okay, so what I'm reading is, Kathleen said that I don't see a mic. And Carol offers, not everyone can sit on the floor like this, which is very true. Yolanda also offered, not everyone sitting on the floor and can sit directly on the floor like this, or even get up. Thank you, Renee. Feel free to unmute if you'd like to bring your voice into the room.
Yeah, I would.
Great.
One of the things that occurs to me, hi, Emma, by the way. One of the things that occurs to me immediately is they're out in the hall where a lot of ambient noise could really distract. And I just want to also triple support the sitting on the floor. In my current state of being physically, that would be very difficult for me, but I would feel a lot of pressure to do it anyway, which I could do, but then it would be very difficult to get back up. So
exactly. Thank you, Chris. Hi. Okay, so Susan offers, I don't see any captioning, nameplates, or alternative seating options. And Roxanne offers, I like the circular dynamic. You can see everyone in the circle. And so that's a real advantage to the circular setup, as seeing and for me, equal capacity to actually hear everyone, see their lips, see their body language. So there's a real advantage to it. And so often we kind of hone in on that advantage. Carol, they're blocking the passageway in the space. What if someone needs access to move through it? Exactly. And then add in the added dynamic of bags and placing of bags. Sala offers, to add to the earlier comments, seems like folks can see each other's faces and are on the same level, which can sometimes help break down power dynamics. And I'm so glad that you brought that up because often it can help on the surface break down power dynamics. It can also introduce a lot of hidden cords and forces that are holding folks together, because there's always a power dynamic. There's always the facilitator. And if we're at a conference, we're wearing name tags and we're very aware of the way that power dynamics can play out in academic spaces. And so there's explicit power dynamics that have been broken down, and then there's implicit power dynamics that are now allowed to run rampant. Roxanne Farkas, I don't have a wheelchair, but someone else might have one that we are, and now we're on different levels. Exactly. This is fantastic, folks. Awesome. And so what are the assumptions? Oh, great. And Sala offers, floor sitting can also help with folks who have ADHD or autism. Exactly. Especially with a tactile interaction and freeing up from being in chairs. Yes. Yeah. So there's real advantages, and there's also other elements that we can think about. So pretty quickly, I'm not sure whether folks want to pop in assumptions, what these observations might reveal. These are not judgments. These are assumptions that are written into the unwritten framework of social organization in any given space. What assumptions might be leading to those? For example, the ways in which we norm bodies and assume a certain mobility, assume a certain visibility, assume a certain auditory capacity, assume a certain neural typical approach. So that's one that's really bubbled up in your observations. Is there anything else that comes up for you? And I'll open it up with, is there anything else that comes up when you're thinking about it? Yeah.
So,
Chris?
yeah, I'm just not sure how to say this, so I'm going to kind of bumble through it and we'll see what comes out at the other end.
Okay.
So I'm old enough to remember when circles came into being in workshops, which was, 50, 60 years ago. And the assumption is it is an equalizer. And my experience of it, both as a participant and as a presenter for decades, is that I'm just going to back up what you said. There's a lot of hidden dynamics inside of a circle, and circles can be nobody can escape a circle.
Mm-hmm.
So if you happen to sit down next to somebody that is problematic, you can't move, as opposed to sitting in chairs where you actually usually can, even somebody that has some mobility issues like me. The other thing is that people can't see people on either side of them, and that changes the dynamic of conversation. It also can be very difficult for people, again, because the circle assumes equality, it ignores other things that could be going on. So not very well said, but that's what I wanted to say.
Thanks for sharing that. I think it was very well said.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so I'm seeing, I really appreciate that, often, and that's the point of the workshop, is to consider things that have become de rigueur in terms of, when we think about ways in which we want people to gather. It's not that we're saying don't have circles, but there might be some very intentional ways in which we could have a circle, paying attention to all of these hidden elements, if this makes sense. I'm curious about how the decision was made to sit on the floor in a circle in the hallway.
Yes.
Right? Yeah, yeah. And who knows? I mean, I don't know how many of you have had this experience in workshops where people send you off like, oh, here's your group, go work. And you have to run around trying to find a space. It's like, or shuffle or roll around trying to find a space where you can actually hear and work together. But so who knows what the decision was? We got this image off of the web. So full disclosure, wasn't a personal photograph. Okay, so is this good? Renee, Rana, Ebony?
I think we have one more comment.
Yes.
Fala?
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
I think some assume that people don't need visual material, slides, printed material. Thank you. Assumption that the speaker or leader must be in front of the room and the participants must ask permission to take care of their bodies. Exactly. And here's the element. If we don't take the time to create the structure and the agreements in which we're going to engage, then all of the structures, forces, and assumptions of dominant culture, white supremacy, colonialism, and capitalism are going to collude to do it for you. And so this is us adding layers into how we might do this, even more informed. Because we know you all do this and you're all excellent facilitators. It's just we're adding more tools.
Yeah. And I just want to quickly put one of Chris's comments from earlier in conversation with what Sala just posted in the chat. You know, Chris said, I would feel a pressure to do it, to sit on the floor with everyone else. And then Sala shared, you know, this assumption that participants have to ask permission to take care of their bodies. One of the key things we want to really surface here is, as facilitators, what are we proactively thinking about in terms of the range of abilities and body minds that might be in the space, but also how do we proactively invite people to take care of their bodies? And that's part of our process of facilitation.
Awesome. Should we do the next one? Okay, awesome. Okay, so this next slide is conference scenario 2. And it is an image, a photograph, again, of many more people. And it's a crowded room with rows of chairs down the center line of this large room. Every seat appears to be taken. And there are people standing in the aisles at either side of the chairs, as well as in the back of the room. Both the standing and the seated individuals are very close to each other, at least appear close to each other. And the legs of most of the individuals seated at the ends of the rows are almost touching the backs of the chairs in front of them. So we have 2 prompts again. 1, what observations can you make based on this image and image description? What assumptions have we internalized that might have led to the space being used this way?
Well, folks think, if it's okay to share a little bit of a personal example from a conference I attended over the summer, where you have really popular sessions. If you think about the wonderful keynotes that they've had at NCORE in the past, and you anticipate a really large crowd, and you go there, you know, thinking you're going to get there in enough time, but you still have to stand or potentially sit on the floor. So for me, at a conference over the summer, because the hotel was very close to the conference center, I didn't bring my mobility aid, because typically I bring it when I have long distance walking, but I didn't anticipate needing to stand, because I thought I planned out things in enough in advance to have a seat. And when that doesn't occur, it forces you to either stand or sit, and both put a lot of pressure on my hip because of mobility constraints. And so I ended up missing other conference sessions because I had to go back to the hotel and rest. So this is kind of my personal lived experience. So even if a person with a disability, particular mobility impairment, pre-plans. If the planning doesn't come from the structural side of it, so the facilitators, the organizers, you may still end up being at a disadvantage. So that's just an example I wanted to share while folks gathered their thoughts.
Thank you, thank you. Yolanda added, in this structure, speakers are at the front of the room, and so it's listening only and little to no participation. Another observation, Dr. Challa added, crowding, limited opportunity to move around with ease could be quite challenging in an emergency. And these are two, actually, these three really do set up the primary, well, some of the primary observations that that leap out at us as well. And the ways in which we can be constrained by the very structures in which we're working. So many times we can turn up as a facilitator with our full plan. We're absolutely invoking the best plan on the planet, and then it's, packed. And so the extent to which we can pre-plan is helpful. There are some key things that help. One, if there are seating like this, how many of you have heard or done it themselves? Because I've done this myself too. Oh, hi, please come in. I really would love you. Could you please just move into the center so there's more space in the edges? And if you wouldn't mind moving forward, please.
Mm-hmm.
And on the surface, that helps with participation. Underneath that, again, assumes mobility, and it ignores needs by people for quick access to doorways.
Mm-hmm.
These chairs being packed in, I'm not sure if anyone had a COVID response to that level of closeness. In the era that we are working in now, that would activate most of us. And then when we're thinking about our colleagues who are immune challenged and the added concerns around that. So that's another element. Emergency is 100% problematic. And when you have this kind of large space, the onus is on us as facilitators to figure out ways to invite participation. Can't tell you how much we talked around about having a webinar and how we do this in a participatory way. It's the same kind of conversation that you'll have. And so there are some really accessible ways that you can do this now in the digital era, where you can work with QR codes, you can work with polls, you can work with Google Docs and invite people to participate in those ways. Okay, what else? Help me out, folks. There were two more assumptions we were going to make sure we spoke to.
Assumption of body size, and who's welcome in the space, what the chairs communicate, what the closeness of the chairs communicate. Yeah, that was a big one that came up for us as we were discussing this. It's like, how accessible is this space to people in larger bodies? What assumptions are made about who's entering the space?
Yeah, and maybe a specific behind that. This is a room where there's almost no room to get in and out of these rows.
Yeah.
So if I'm looking at this and I'm walking in, and again, given that my body doesn't always move the way that I would like it to, and I don't want to call attention to that, I'm going to stand in the back of the room, whether I should be sitting or not. And like Ebony said, if I brought my very, very fancy walker, I'm in okay shape. But if I didn't, if I said, well, this is just, I can just take my cane and I'll be fine, then I'm probably going to walk out of the room, because it's just not possible for me to stand that long.
Which brings us to, I mean, that's exactly, Chris, thank you for that, because that's exactly speaks to the lived experience. Folks with fluid abilities and the ways in which we can too quickly make assumptions about people's capacity in the moment based on signals that we think we're paying attention to. But in reality, most of this is fairly cryptic. We're not going to be able to look at our audience and know straight away, oh, we've got it covered and we'll make sure these people can sit here and just, it doesn't work that way. Instead, it's back-end organizing to make sure that as many people as we can participate fully, with the caveat that we're always learning. And so the more we do this, the more people will tell us what they need. And so there's constant shifting going on. Okay.
I can
Is
give
this
one
good?
final comment before we switch over. I just invite folks to think about the inverted option of this. If you're in that same space and you only have a few participants, how often would a presenter may say, everyone come to the front so I don't have to yell? When in a space like that, you may have planned, the conference attendees may have planned to have that larger space thinking that there would be high participation and there's lower participation. And then as a facilitator, you may have participants still sit at the back of the room, think that they could be choosing that space for a reason outside. And I think the natural inclination would be, hey, let's come together. Everyone comes to the front closer to me. But if you make that assumption or you make that change for your own comfort as a facilitator, how do you disadvantage potential participants? So that was just my close to say, think about that same space with high level of participants and then also a small level of participants in the same space.
Ebony reminded me,
Yeah,
you know,
go
the
ahead.
crazy pass the microphone, you
Yes.
know? Yeah, we want to make sure everybody can participate. So, but if we only have one microphone, and I've had this happen, only one microphone, and it's not battery powered, and so people have to come up, but a lot of people will choose not to come up for all kinds of reasons. And we need to have in a room this size 4 or 5 microphones. We need to have people able to reach around, and likelihood that that's been prepared for is small.
One update I will share for NCORE this year is all conference rooms will have wireless mics in them. So we can move the mic around the room rather than asking people to move to the mic. So we'll talk more about that also in a bit. So, but thank you for naming that, Chris. So let's sort of transition a little bit and move from kind of where we are now, which is really thinking about our noticing skills, both noticing what we're observing as far as like what often happens physically in conference spaces and the ways in which ableist structures are in operation, and we may be putting them into operation without even realizing it. And then what we're really going to be thinking about now is also not just the choice of how we use space, but how we invite people to engage during our sessions when we're facilitating, and ways we may be perpetuating ableism through that. We'll also, towards the end of the session, highlight some helpful frameworks and some folks whose work would be helpful as you think about honing and nuancing what anti-ableism from an intersectional justice lens looks like. So that's where we're headed. What I'd like to do now is to invite us to sit with and unpack a little bit how ableist pressures show up in conference spaces. I mean, we've been doing this already, but one of the things to be really thinking about is sometimes ableist pressures are actually introduced into spaces by presenters in the things that we ask. So for example, it's come up already when we ask people to move to the front and sit closer, we're thinking about wanting people to be in community and wanting people to be able to talk to each other and maybe, work in small groups. And we're thinking about like our goals for how we want people to engage, but we're not necessarily thinking about someone who's chosen a seat in the back row because they realize their body mind might need access to a restroom at any time, and they want to make sure that that's easily accessible for them, right? And so, this has surfaced already, but one thing I'm thinking about that we often ask people to do that's often connected with asking people to come and sit close to each other is inviting people to turn and talk at different points with the people next to them or behind them. And I want us to think about in what ways might that generate what is experienced as ableist pressures for different participants in the room. So thoughts about that particular thing that we're often asking folks to do or being asked to do in session spaces.
And to clarify, Renee, you're asking us to think about what has become go-to ways of inviting engagement and processing, at least in the room. Thank you.
Yes. So when we ask folks to turn and talk to the folks around them or behind them, in what ways might that present an access barrier for some folks in the room?
You have a comment, Renee, in the chat?
Yes. Carol. So yes, and so some of this has to do with comfort. When we think too about the different ways people engage related to, neurodivergence as well, there's aspects of interpersonal dynamics and forced interpersonal dynamics that can feel like access barriers for folks for sure. And it does make an assumption about people's comfort levels in general, especially in the era of COVID, naming that as well and resurfacing that. Other things that might present access barriers for folks.
And while folks are thinking about that, can I add on to that, what you just offered? In response to Carol's comment about not wanting to talk to strangers in those circumstances, hold that acknowledgement, and as we move into frameworks, that's really encompasses the shift that we're hoping to invite, which is, yes, we're here about accessibility to make sure anyone with non-normative bodies and minds can engage equally, right? So disability rights and justice, that kind of approach. And we're hoping to open this up into a framework of understanding the wild and wonderful diversity with which all humans can come, and also the ways in which ableism polices each other. And so it's gonna bubble up. Sorry, I'll shut up now.
And no, and what, to echo Emma's point and to circle back to that first photo where everyone was sitting on the floor in a circle and this assumption of, okay, we're all equal. I mean, one of the dynamics of interacting sometimes in spaces, depending on what you're being asked to engage in relation to, can also be concerns about impact and harm and microaggressions and how identity and lived experience and power and privilege show up in those conversations in ways that can make people reluctant to turn and talk to a stranger with some consideration of what they might experience in that conversation space. So there's a lot to name there as we think about the dynamics interpersonally that often happen in spaces. And thanks to Sala is thinking about, turning around and thinking about, body mobility and how we're asking people to move their bodies in order to engage with others. And yes, Charla, yeah, absolutely. Some folks are processors. They listen, they learn by listening, and they want to engage in their body minds in ways that are comfortable for them and that relate to their own processing styles. One thing I'm also thinking about too, we probably all have this experience where we are in conference rooms and everyone in the room is asked to start talking simultaneously, and then you can't hear anything, and that's especially true as far as increasing access barriers for folks who are hard of hearing or deaf, right? And so like even folks who would ordinarily not have access barriers as it relates to hearing often struggle to hear in those spaces when everyone is asked to speak at the same time. So just thinking about that, especially when you walk into a room and you realize there's 70 people in there and the volume that's going to happen as part of that interaction. I want us to think too, as we have been in the role of facilitators, but also having been attendees at sessions, are there other things that presenters do that we feel like add ableist pressures in terms of the things they ask us to do during conferences? Folks want to, yeah, Sarah, yes. When presenters say, I'm not planning to use the mic, but let me know if you can't hear me. So absolutely just layers and layers of ableism happening there. And that is something that not just participants do, but facilitators often do as well. I've seen facilitators say, I like to move around and the mic is attached to the podium. So I'm just gonna move through the room. Yes. Other
And
things.
I was just going to say, I think that kind of engages this concept of forced intimacy, of people having to disclose if they don't want to disclose or if they're not comfortable disclosing. Yeah.
Yes.
Yep. I also think it could be very easy to go on the one side to say, I will never do activities like this, versus thinking creatively about ways in which you can incorporate a think, pair, share, but with something that's also based on your comfort level or ability level. Some may want to journal and reflect. Some may want to just sit and think about what we've discussed. Others may want to talk as a group. Let's use this time and space in order to process this information or content in a way that's relevant for us. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to take away some of the tools of the trade. And I love that comment about think, pair, share is higher ed 101. You're so right on that. And some of us may say, yes, take it away all the way. But if you decide to use a think, pair, share, how can you combine it with other things so that everyone has the opportunity to reflect on the content? And I think we have a raised hand from Sala.
Yeah.
Hi, I was in a how do I lower it? I went to an NCORE session a few years ago. This was pre-pandemic, but I was also still very wary of like touching people. Like I don't like to do that. And there were maybe 80 to 90 people in that session, and they had the entire room get into a massive circle to do an exercise where we're passing a pen along. And so it's like this object that we're all touching, like so many hands. So I was like, oh, that's an interesting thing. So that was like one thing that, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I see. Thank you, Sala. Yes, I think physical contact and just thinking about what it means, COVID aside, folks have varying levels of immunocompromised realities. And so thinking about the implications of activities that we're asking people to engage in. I see in the chat, Christy's talking about forced or pressured share outs, right? So it's not just, hey, think, pair, what about the share, right? Like asking people then to project and speak to the whole group. And then, yes, so asking folks to stand up, raise your hand. Thanks, Sarah. So, ways in which we're expecting people to engage interpersonally, verbally, physically, thinking about what are the expectations and are those expectations equally accessible for all folks? And so to echo something Ebony said a moment ago, it's not that we don't ask people to do things or invite people to do things. It's that we make sure we have multiple ways that people can do things so that they have a pathway for engagement and participation that's accessible for them. And so that's a big piece of what we're trying to emphasize today, is that if we're not thinking about how different methods of engagement might create access barriers for some folks, we haven't imagined the range of possibilities we want to offer to folks, for sure. So what about participant generated ableist pressures in spaces. We've already talked about the microphone issue, right? There's always somebody in the room who screams out, I don't need a mic, right? I can project, I'm really loud. And sometimes presenters and facilitators don't check them on that and just let them yell across the room, right? Although we've probably all been in sessions where people start screaming, use the mic also. So thinking about how those dynamics can play out in conference sessions. One thing if you noticed at NCORE last year, every conference room had use the mic posters pasted all over the room in every space. Not that people were still not using mic. So I think it's like recognizing that we have a collective responsibility for access, and how do we invite people to play their role in being responsible in that way. We talked a little bit about this when we looked at the first photo with people's bags in the aisle behind the, or in the hallway behind them. But a common thing that you see when you go into conference spaces is people have their bags in the center aisle if they're sitting in the end rows, or they have stuff, in front of them on the floor in their individual rows. So thinking about the impact that has as far as access in spaces. Other examples is the language that we use. We often hear folks surfacing ableist language, often without even recognizing it. There's so many words that have become so commonplace in our everyday language that folks don't even recognize the impact that they have as far as perpetuating ableism, as far as body minds. Are there other examples of ways that ableism shows up in the things that other attendees might be doing in presentation spaces?
I think one of the things that emerges for me is all the things that we're naming around things we think about as facilitators. The minute we form small working groups, all those same dynamics will run unless we offer an alternative structure with very intentional invitations to these are the different ways of. And I think we're going to go into that a little bit too.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So I want to pause for just a second and thinking about the things on the slide for the participant generated pressures. I want us to think from a facilitator lens, looking at the first one, for example, where people are placing their personal items. As a facilitator, what can you do to proactively help to reduce that particular ableist pressure from occurring in your presentation space?
I really appreciate just, naming, like if folks could move their belongings, away from the center aisle and
Mhm.
naming the reason why it helps make this a more accessible space.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I think as we reinforce, as people are coming into a space before the session even starts, once you see that happening, to start engaging with it proactively so that other folks in the room hear it. One of the things I've noticed is like after you do that a few times, other people will often ask people to move their bags too, because it's part of the culture that we're creating together before the session starts. So that can be a really helpful collective community building approach that can be useful. I see, yes, Carol, 100%. Pacing is super important. Sometimes we feel a pressure, super capitalist pressure to like generate as much product as possible and to cram it all in there so people get their money's worth from the session in ways that work against making the space accessible, making the space comfortable, inviting really thoughtful engagement and reflection. So pacing is important. Creating time to allow folks to process is important, right? We recognize that some people are analytical and they need processing time. So I think part of the pacing issue is expecting people to respond immediately with an answer. And then sometimes facilitators feel frustrated with silence. They're worried that nothing's happening when there's a lot happening in the background for folks. It's just we're giving space for that to happen. So pacing is super, super important. Yeah. Sala.
Sorry, I was trying to pace myself and not take up too much space.
No.
I was in a workshop once where the facilitator at the very beginning kind of named like how I'm so sorry, Raina or Rana, did I pronounce your name?
Rana.
Oh geez, I was wrong both times. I'm sorry. Rana. How you said like just naming it. And he did a great job with that. And then he also said, and also if we have folks trickling in, mid-presentation or something, what everyone's role is in this presentation is you're going to welcome them and you're going to fill them in once they, help them find a seat, like whoever's closest or something. And he did it in a way where like he incentivized it. He said, and I will throw some candy at your table if I see it. So it got a little wild, but it was like a fun kind of way to just build a culture of like, welcoming and stuff. So that was cool.
Nice. Nice. I'm a big fan of placing candy as opposed to throwing, but yes, 100%. I love that. So I do appreciate the ways in which we start to understand that accessibility isn't and can never be created solely by the facilitator. Everyone in the space impacts the access of everyone else. And so the more we help each other understand that and play an intentional role in that, the more we create more accessible, caring communities. And that's a huge piece of what we want to emphasize today. Yeah. I want to check in because, when you look at number 2 and 3 on this list of participant generated, right? So someone who's reluctant to use the microphone or someone who's using ableist language. Those are moments as a facilitator where you're kind of called to respond to dynamics that are perpetuating ableism. So I want to invite folks, for either of those 2 examples, is there an approach you would take to engage in a way that isn't about shaming, but how do we foster a community of collective care? Anybody have examples of how they have engaged with those kinds of behaviors in the past during sessions?
And then while folks are thinking, Carol had a question as well, if you don't mind.
Yes, yes. Carol, if you want to drop it in the parking lot at the very end, we will circle back to it. At the very end of the Google Doc at the bottom, there's a parking lot section. Yes.
And if you're just using chat too, I'll pop it in the parking lot for you, whatever you prefer.
Yep. Anybody ever had someone say they don't need a mic when they're in your session you're the facilitator and someone's like, oh, don't worry, I don't need a mic, I can project, or I'm really, really loud. I know I've had that happen in lots of sessions. We have it happen constantly at our faculty meetings, but we can unpack that later, right? And so thinking about, what we say in that moment, right? I mean, one thing I often say is that the microphone isn't for you, right? It's an access tool that, ensures everyone in the space can hear. And so I think it's a reminder, an invitation to decenter oneself and realize that we have a collective responsibility to ensure the space is accessible for everyone. And so for me, I think about the both and. I think about what is the front end space that we co-create with folks as we're sort of beginning the Crystal. I love Crystal. So thinking about how at the beginning of a conference session, we are setting the expectation that we are all collectively responsible for ensuring access. And then in the moment where someone says, oh, I don't need a mic, there's a reminder, an invitation back into this community of care where we are ensuring that everyone's access needs get met in the space, right? One of the things about the use of ableist language is that almost all of the time people are completely unaware that what they're saying, resonates with ableism in some way. And so I think how we engage in those moments is really important, right? I'm a big fan of not shaming people, especially when I realize they probably don't even understand the impact of what they've just said or done. It's counterproductive, right? But sometimes I reiterate and I'll say things like, one thing I recognize is that we're always really trying to emphasize certain things, right? And we use crazy, for example, a lot to emphasize the intensity of something. But I'm also mindful that that term is really resonant with, the way we think about what it means to be crazy, right? And how we have normalized notions of body minds that view some as disruptive, as atypical, as deficit. And so when we think about language for emphasis, I want to invite us to think about language that doesn't echo back to, what has been used to other, right? And to do both psychological and often physical, structural, economic, medical harm to folks. And so thinking about that. So sometimes it's just a matter of surfacing something and putting it on the radar. Like, this is what I'm hearing beneath that word that we use all the time, that we want to be mindful. This is the current that we're bringing into the space with that word, and an invitation into that recognition. So I want to be mindful of time, and I want to pass the proverbial mic to Rana, who is going to have some fun with the group.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I'm mindful of time too. And so I'm wondering, I know we have an activity built around this, and I'm wondering if I might just sort of introduce it and get folks sort of thinking about what assumptions might be coming up here, and then maybe folks can add to that in the end, because I know we have some really important discussion around a intersectional definition of ableism that I'm hoping we have time to get to. So,
Yeah.
so we're going to be moving into another discussion that sort of, and I think we're already doing this, moves us away from talking about just the physical space to really the interpersonal space. So this might take just a minute to sort of wrap your heads around, because I'm going to be reading a description of an activity, a scenario that might come up in a conference space. And your job is to really draw out how the activity could be better framed for access, how each group can use multimodality to provide members with different ways to share their ideas with each other, and how the presenter could use multimodality to really reduce access barriers for participants. So you're not actually doing the activity I'm reading out loud or talking about microaggressions, but rather thinking about the processes involved in this scenario, and then reflecting on the questions in the chat or the doc, or speaking out here. So the sample scenario is, you're at a conference and you're given these instructions. So for this activity, each group will review a different portion of a transcript from a class discussion to identify comments that might be experienced as microaggressions. One member of each group will read the transcript aloud to the group. One member of each group will write down the possible microaggressions on the flip chart provided on the table. And one member of each group will share aloud the group's responses to the rest of the room. And one member of each group will go over and tape the flip chart paper to the wall. So what we're asking you to think about is, how could this activity be framed differently to invite accessible participation of group members? How could each group use multimodality to provide members different ways to share their ideas with each other? And how could the presenter use multimodality to reduce access barriers for the participants? So, when you have an activity where people are doing multiple different things and inhabiting multiple different roles, what we've kind of talked about as a group together is that sometimes people will just really quickly volunteer to do something, and there's no real conversation or normalization of conversation around access needs. So someone might be like, I'm happy to go up and write, be the recorder or do the flip chart thing, but they're not necessarily choosing intentionally based on their own access needs or considering other people's access needs. So unless we really actively build that into what the group does, the person might get stuck with something that just doesn't align with their access needs. So, we as presenters want to be doing our best to not make assumptions about comfort and ability with writing, about speaking out loud, about moving across the room and about the room. And I think what's interesting about this activity is that on one hand, there are multiple different roles that offer an opportunity for people with multiple different access needs to feel valued in that space, but without any kind of prior conversation or prior framing around that, we can slide into something that really forces people into roles that aren't accessible to them. So it takes a really intentional setup and practice ahead of time to really take that opportunity that this type of activity might be able to offer. So I'm wondering, as I'm talking, what's coming up for folks? What do you notice about this activity? What could be presented differently?
I mean, I just want to echo and synthesize something we were talking about in the past slide, which is that we have a collective responsibility for access. And when we build that into the activity, where we first ask the group to talk about, which part of this feels comfortable, accessible for you, and that's part of the process of working together as a group. It doesn't just benefit the participants for the sake of that particular activity. It starts to sort of socialize in us an expectation that this is part of what we do when we're working collectively with other folks. And so I think, there's for me, the work I do is about culture change. And so it's not just about making something accessible in the moment, but building practices that invite intentionality around access in all the spaces. So I just wanted to name that.
You. And Yolanda said, provide time for discussion, sticky notes for participants to post their responses around the room, posting on different flip charts, allow time to discuss and interpret what they observe regarding responses on flip charts. Sarah said, removing the expectation of reading aloud. Yeah, you might come across the group. There's an assumption here that there's a range of ability in the group, right? And there may not be in a particular group. So removing that expectation, yeah.
And the other thing, as far as multimodality from the presenter role, is naming too, when you invite groups to identify what roles they want to play, is to also say there may be roles that don't feel comfortable or accessible for anyone in the group. And if so, I will work with you to make sure that, there's still a pathway for you, right? You can figure out within your group if there's ways that make more sense for you, but I'm also happy to work with you as a facilitator as well.
Yeah, Crystal said maybe the facilitator reads aloud for folks who find reading difficult rather than making it the participant's role. Yeah, so allowing folks to submit their responses in writing if that's what's more comfortable for them. Yeah.
So I want to invite us to move into the definition so we can start to really surface people doing really transformative work beyond those of us who are just in this space together as attendees and facilitators. So let's invite Emma to go next.
Yeah, so you will have noticed themes and threads emerging as we've moved through these more experiential approaches to help us think about improving the way we make our spaces accessible. Now we're kind of asking us to turn that again and consider those deeper layers, consider those threads, and as we've written on the slide here, unpacking the individual and collective needs resulting from disabling capitalist and colonial imposition of time and demand for productivity, in the ways that capitalism has has structured our world, the ways in which ableism is not just about disability justice and accessibility. It is also recognizing the ways in which it is weaving with all the other forces colluding to make capitalism true and colonialism true. And they become the norm unless we interfere with them intentionally. The ways in which white supremacy is held in place by ableism, kind of this hidden force, or not so hidden force, really tangible force that's really holding racism in action in every space in which we're acting. It's holding the ways in which we gender each other, the ways in which we judge and police, both state-sanctioned and also individual ways in which we engage. So things that we would consider deeper layers here are the ways that masking is playing a role and must play a role when we are in these professional yet implied intimate spaces. The ways in which processing time is intimately linked with assumptions about competency, intelligence, who has the right to generate knowledge in that space, and then multimodal ways in which we engage in sharing out, verbal debriefing, digital text, and presentation screen displays. So there's just some very kind of quick ways to start the deepening. And then, so pass it on, next.
Okay.
And this is me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So we're going to provide a definition of ableism here. You know, there are many different definitions of ableism out there, but I think very few of them actually acknowledge the inextricable linking of ableism with these other systems of oppression that Emma has been pointing to. So T.L. Lewis is a disability rights attorney and educator, and they really crystallized a definition of ableism that does acknowledge how these oppressions inform one another and really depend on one another to exist. So TL defines ableism, I'm going to read it out loud, it's here on the screen for you, as a system of assigning value to people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, productivity, desirability, intelligence, excellence, and fitness. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in eugenics, in anti-Blackness, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. This systemic oppression leads to people and society determining people's value based on their culture, their age, their language, appearance, religion, birth or living place, their health and wellness, that's in quotes, and or their ability to satisfactorily reproduce, excel, and behave. And this last sentence is, you do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. So we have a few prompts that we want you to consider. Again, use any of the modalities available to you. I'll put them in the chat box for you. So what resonates with this definition? What is not in the definition that you think should be? Is there anything in the definition that you're surprised by? And what work is the last sentence and statement doing? You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism.
I'll just name as someone who's worked across a lot of identity-based spaces, that so much of the intersectional harm associated with ableism, transphobia, anti-Blackness, fatphobia, all of the things, is this idea of whose body minds have value, whose existence and humanity has value. And I think about who gets socially and culturally dehumanized, and how that relates to the spectrum of from microaggressions to systemic violence, and how that shows up every day in this deeply intersectional way that is disabling across all of the body minds that exist and are viewed as less than. So I just wanted to name that because that's a key piece that shows up across all of my work.
I was just going to mention, especially in regards to prompt 3, especially when you're, putting this content in spaces that may have not been familiar. Sometimes like this presentation is accessibility. And so folks will think that that's the only thing you have to discuss. And so the intersectional nature of ableism with other systems of oppression that you mentioned before can sometimes be surprising to folks in spaces such as this, that, you think that that conversation is excluded from this one. So that is things that I have noticed in spaces such as this, that folks are surprised that you bring a full conversation of marginalization and dehumanization to the forefront when you're talking about ableism. And I wonder if that resonates with anyone.
About the last statement, you do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. I'm wondering if there's anything that's coming up for folks around that. Kathleen said, resonates with me as an elder with a disability.
Thanks for sharing, Kathleen.
I'd like to surface back as a statement that was made, half an hour ago now. Does it count if I hate talking to strangers in these circumstances? And that statement directly links into this broader way in which we're asking us to engage with accessibility in the ways that we design facilitation spaces. And that is a perfectly reasonable response by many people in public spaces such as these.
Yes.
Yeah. Yolanda said, all are affected by the value that is placed on our bodies and minds. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yep.
Carol said, this is eye-opening for me. I think about this in terms of gender and race all the time, but the structure is the same. The argument is essentially the same. This is so helpful to hear.
Yep.
Dr. Sharla said, intent versus impact isms impact each of us in multiple ways.
Yeah.
Something
Oh, go ahead, Brenda.
I was just going to say something I think about a lot in terms of this last statement of you don't have to be disabled to experience ableism is the ways that that disability is often called upon to invoke racism.
Mm-hmm.
And the ways that colonial violence is actually disabling and can be used in disabled manners. And
Right.
that's a preview to one of our presentations at NCORE, but I will just say that and stop there.
And I do want to respond to Kiara's point in the last comment in the chat. I mean, it's recognizing that like being multi-ethnic isn't a disability, right? But the ways in which you experience harm is disabling, right? I think about one of my hats on campus is to coordinate our bias response team. And the number of times I sit across from students of color, undocumented students, international students, Muslim students whose experience of interpersonal harm in living and learning spaces is disabling as far as their ability to fully participate and feel whole in those spaces. So it's not that who they are is a disability. It is that the forces, these intersectional systems of oppression, have a disabling impact as far as our students' ability to be affirmed and supported in spaces and to bring their whole selves in a way that are seen and supported and valued. So I know we're at time. And I want to be mindful of the capitalist pressures that everyone is under across the time zones that they're in, and they may have other meetings to attend. One thing that I want to say is that we are going to make the slides, the Google Doc, which has our notes and comments in it. We're also going to curate sort of a capture of key takeaways, and we will share that with all of you. One thing that just to quickly note in the slide deck after this that we don't have time for are some key frameworks: disability justice, intersectionality, discrit, tribal crit, decolonizing and liberatory methods. We've highlighted key authors and activists who are doing work that might be helpful for you to explore, and a few questions to ask yourselves as facilitators. But all of this we will make accessible to folks afterwards. So I just want to thank everyone for being in community with us, and for really leaning into this conversation. It's so critical to our work as educators and to the space we're fostering with our co-learners. So I just want to pass the mic to any of my other co-facilitators who want to be appreciative in any way.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us. And I think that this last slide is a perfect one for us to kind of lean on, because this is just the start. Hopefully, it may be a continuation for some, a start for others, but we hope that you're able to delve in and reflect. And then from the comments, it seems as though that is already occurring in real time and that this becomes ongoing. And then we offer the opportunity to get in community of practice with like-minded individuals in the spaces in which you are already occupying in order to continue these conversations. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Look forward to seeing some of you at NCORE.
And wish to thank John and Amber who've assisted in making this conversation accessible for all of us, including those of us with hard of hearing, deaf, lived experiences. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today to learn about accessibility in your presentations. I really am grateful to you, Ebony, Rana, Emma, Renee, for your service to the NCORE community. You've made this conference better by performing this incredible service and gift to the community. I hope that those who watch this and bring this into their work, that will find that it has a transformative impact in their own lives, deepening your relationships and deepening your community around you. Thank you so much for joining today. We look forward to seeing you on the island of Oahu after the end of May, and my best to you. Be well.